Hello and welcome to the first edition of Great Men, the show dedicated to jumping into the lives of some of the most influential men of history and discussing their actions, writings, and philosophy. I'm your host, Luke Newcomb, and today we will be discussing the third President of the United States and father of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. We'll take a look at what he deemed to be his biggest achievements in life, how he accomplished each of those achievements, and his thoughts and ideas concerning them. We'll be looking at some of the writings and quotes of his, and attempting to dissect his character through them to find the man behind the facts. Stick around for all that and more in today's episode of Great Men. Thomas Jefferson is one of the most recognizable and quotable figures in American history, being among the most well-known founding fathers and immortalized in monuments and museums around the country, from the Jefferson Memorial to the Monticello Museum to his gigantic presence as one of the 4 presidents privileged enough to have been depicted on Mount Rushmore. He authored one of the documents that can be credited as having a huge influence on Western ideals of independence, served as the President of the United States, doubled the size of the U.S., and prohibited the importation of slaves into America, among many other achievements. But how are we to quantify the contributions of a man with so rich a life? Where do we even begin to discuss such a packed full lifetime? Well, one good area to start would be to talk about some of the things that Jefferson himself considered his greatest achievements. Jefferson had always been a bit of a control freak. If something was to represent him, he wanted a direct hand in making sure it was exactly how he wanted. That extended all the way to his gravestone. Before his death, he left explicit instructions on what was going to serve as the marker to where his body lay, drawing out his own schematics and supplying the epitaph he wanted on it, consisting of this inscription and not one word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Because, as he explained, these 3 accomplishments were to be the testimonials to his life and legacy, he also instructed that it was to be made out of coarse stone, that no one might be tempted to destroy it for the value of its materials. But why did these achievements specifically deserve to be so adamantly insisted upon by Jefferson to make up his legacy? What was so special about them in particular that wasn't about his other achievements, such as the presidency, the Louisiana Purchase, or the establishment of the military academy? There have been many speculations. Perhaps these 3 were the only achievements that Jefferson could take singular credit for, although, as we'll soon discuss, this isn't even entirely true. Regardless of the reasons, I think these specific landmarks in the life of the 3rd president make a fantastic angle for studying Thomas Jefferson, 3 different angles to help illustrate his philosophy, politics, and life. If you'll join me, we can dive in together and see how each of these instances uniquely sheds light on a different aspect of the character of Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence. The year is 1776. The antagonism of the British Empire against their colonies in America is reaching its boiling point, violence and struggle flaring up throughout New England. An idea is spreading quickly throughout the colonies. A bold idea, a dangerous idea. An idea of independence, of splitting ties between the local governments and the tiny island across the sea that held them with such a tight grip. The Continental Congress, a collection of delegates from the 13 American colonies, was fully intending to act on these ideas. But to do that, they needed a document written not only as a message declaring their independence to the British government, but as a message to their own American people, a rallying cry, a call to arms. The Declaration would also become a message to the world, a message of freedom and hope. But it all started out with 5 men. The Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft the Declaration, those 5 being Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Robert R. Livingston of New York, John Adams of Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. And right from the start, the committee knew who they were going to choose as the author of this most important document. Richard Henry Lee, author of the Lee Resolution, a resolution proposing independence for the American colonies. Lee was well known and popular within the colonies, and a great writer, the perfect choice for the author of our founding document. Of course, we know that isn't how it ended up happening. Accepting at first this role, Lee was unexpectedly pulled home because of his wife's illness, and that, coupled with the fact that he was also writing the Articles of Confederation at the time, left him with little opportunity to draft the Declaration of Independence. The committee would now have to choose someone else to write the document. That new author was to be a member of the committee, Thomas Jefferson, the delegate from Virginia. Jefferson, the youngest member of the committee at 33 years old at the time, was quiet inward and confessed his own love of silence and quiet. He was chosen due to his reputation of literature, science, and, quote, a happy talent for composition. He was also seen as a dedicated patriot by his contemporaries, plus, as Adams suggested, he had the least enemies in Congress out of the 5. Jefferson was initially extremely hesitant to take on the responsibilities of drafting the Declaration, insisting that John Adams should write it instead. However, the committee eventually convinced him, with no small help from the flurries of compliments given to him on his writing skills by Adams. Once he dedicated himself to the task, Jefferson spent only 17 days writing the first draft before submitting it to his colleagues, first and foremost showing it to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, as he respected their opinions more than those of anyone else. They, along with the rest of the committee, made a total of 86 changes to the Declaration, the majority of which was still heavily Jefferson. It is worth noting here that Jefferson initially wanted a section of the Declaration to be a condemnation of slavery and British contributions to the global slave trade. The passage is as follows, talking about King George. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Unfortunately, however, the Continental Congress decided to cut out Jefferson's anti-slavery sentiments from the Declaration, for reasons that still remain complicated and fuzzy. One of those reasons perhaps being that the Declaration was to serve primarily as unifying documents, calling on the 13 colonies to help fight the war. Open hostility to slavery, which the southern colonies so relied on for economic stability, could serve to anger or alienate the southerners and keep them from uniting to the cause. Whatever the reason, this omission of a clear and strict anti-slavery message should be seen as a grave moral blunder not only in the Declaration itself, but in the founding decades of a country otherwise so dedicated to individual liberty and freedom. On July 4th, 1776, after 2 more days of editing and refining the document, the Declaration of Independence was accepted and adopted by the Continental Congress, an official statement that from that day forth, America was to be its own free nation, independent of British rule. Copies were printed and dispersed all throughout the nation, a ringing bell of hope to all those who felt oppressed and marginalized under King George's rule. The Declaration of Independence was the written beginning to a bright new era of freedom, not just for America, but for the world. Under 2 weeks before his death, Thomas Jefferson prepared a letter for the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the document. In the letter, he explained that the Declaration, quote, is to be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst their chains, under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings of security and self-government, the form of which we have submitted restores to the free right, to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened, or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, or a favored few booted and spurred ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them." End quote. The Declaration greatly mirrored Jefferson's own politics and opinions on government. His most fundamental political belief, in his own words, was, quote, absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority. His would be a government run by the people, as the rule of the majority would be the most appropriate method of ensuring the rights of the people remain unmolested. America should, in his opinion, stay small, rigorously frugal, and simple. He was a democratic Republican very opposed to large-scale institutions, including government, banks, factories, and the like, instead wanting the U.S. to be primarily a nation of, quote, human farmers, planters, and plain folk. This ideology had him butting heads with some of the Federalists in government, such as Alexander Hamilton, a man he accused of being aristocratic and very nearly pro-Britain because of his push for more industrialized society and a national bank. The smaller a nation's government was, the better it would be for those living under its rule. Virtually each representative, action, and regulation should be decided on by the citizens of the nation through a voting process, and the United States Constitution should be interpreted in its strictest, most restricting sense. The government was, in his mind, a group of parasites living off the efforts of the common man. He said in his inaugural address, quote, "A wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and it is necessary to close the circle of our felicities." End quote. Here, we move on to the second of Thomas Jefferson's self-claimed greatest achievements, the writing of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This statute was a bill penned by Jefferson and submitted to the Virginia General Assembly in 1779 as a bill establishing religious freedom throughout the state of Virginia. This meant that no one should be compelled to frequent any religious worship place or ministry, or be punished or penalized in any way on account of his own religion. This bill was ratified in 1786 and was an important step to the idea of religious freedom for all religions. As Jefferson put it, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mahometan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. Jefferson's philosophy of government and religion was one of strict separation, that the government shouldn't really have any hand in the public religion at all. These views led to attacks being thrown at Jefferson, accusations of atheism and godlessness. But quite to the contrary, Jefferson was very encouraging of religion, and Christian virtues, in his eyes, made a nation nobler and stronger. However, he kept his view that any official call to prayer by the government was unconstitutional and, as president, was criticized for refusing to issue a prayer proclamation in a time of crisis, as both his predecessors had done. He felt that the separation of church and state was vital to any functioning republic. Personally, Jefferson seemed to value religion and called himself a Christian, despite a disbelief in the Holy Trinity or the divinity of Christ. He greatly respected Jesus as a teacher and dedicated himself to Christian morality, but rejected any and all supernatural events depicted in the Bible as mere fairy tales. In fact, he created his own version of the Gospels titled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, or more simply, the Jefferson Bible. This translation edited out any supernatural events, instead focusing on Jesus' morals and philosophy. Despite claims otherwise, Thomas Jefferson didn't seem to be an atheist, as he could commonly be found praying and talking about God. His religion could more accurately be described as theism, rather than pure Christianity. He read broadly and studied many different beliefs, regularly attending the services of different religions. Overall, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was a huge step forward in the idea of freedom of religion for America, one of the nation's defining innovations. In 1878, in Reynolds v. United States, the first in the Supreme Court case addressing the religion clauses of the First Amendment, the court stated that Jefferson's statute defined religious liberty and the true distinction between what properly belonged to the church and what to the state. Thomas Jefferson's dream, since before the Revolution, was the dispersion of knowledge and wisdom throughout the general public, not only to the rich and powerful, but among even the poorest of citizens. This, he thought, was the only way to sustain a real democracy. To this end, Jefferson proposed and founded the University of Virginia, which opened its doors in 1825. Jefferson, near the end of his life at this point, called this act the last act of usefulness I can render. This institution stood out from the other universities of the day in several ways. For one, this school was completely separated from religion. There was to be no theology taught, instead placing the emphasis on science and nature. The church, in the center of many school campuses at the time, was to be replaced in Jefferson's University by a large rotunda modeled off the Roman Pantheon and holding a library. Jefferson himself curated a list of over 7,000 books he wanted to be kept in the library. Another way the university distinguished itself from its competition was its diversity of classes. Instead of being a school of medicine or a school of law, the University of Virginia was home to various different subjects, 8 main ones, those classes being medicine, law, mathematics, chemistry, ancient languages, modern languages, natural philosophy, and moral philosophy. And none of these classes were required courses. All of them were elective, Jefferson being for the idea of self-taught learning rather than being a fed curriculum that was the same for every student. Jefferson drew up the plans for the physical buildings himself, especially stressing that it shouldn't be a single building. On the contrary, the university, he said, should be an academical village, a collection of different buildings, each for different purposes, housing students, professors, and acting as classrooms. He even planned to build a large garden for botanical study, but it wasn't built until 1870, decades after the man's death. Jefferson personally designed the layout of the university within only 15 days of the establishment of it. Almost every day he would ride 4 miles on horseback from his home in Monticello to oversee the construction, making sure everything was perfect. The University of Virginia was one of Jefferson's biggest contributions to America's education system, but it was by no means his only one. He was very passionate about the subject of an educated public, saying, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." He wanted knowledge and education to be widely available to all people throughout the nation, and proposed a system of education for those who couldn't afford private schools, which he elaborated on in Notes on the State of Virginia, written in 1781. The notes say as follows: "This bill proposes to lay off every county into small districts of 5 or 6 miles square, called hundreds, and each of them to establish a school for teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the tutor to be supported by the 100, and every person in it entitled to send their children 3 years gratis, and as much longer as they please paying for it. These schools to be under a visitor, who is annually to choose the boy of best genius in the school, or whose parents are too poor to give them further education, and to send him forward to one of the grammar schools, of which 20 are proposed to be erected in different parts of Virginia, for teaching Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches of numerical arithmetic. Of the boys thus sent in any 1 year, trial is to be made at the grammar school 1 or 2 years, and the best genius of the whole selected and continued 6 years, and the residue dismissed. By this means 20 of the best geniuses will be raked from the rubbish annually, and instructed at the public expense so far as the grammar schools go." End quote. Jefferson was a big proponent for public schools, but he seemed to be very against the centralized government-run school system. He warned that if even a state government were to take the business into his own hands, they would be badly mismanaged, depraved by abuses. He wanted to give the ultimate authority of a child's education to the parent of the child, saying that to think schools would be better managed by, quote, "any authority of the government than by the parents within each ward is a belief beyond experience." As well, he opposed compulsory attendance laws, contrary to popular belief. He said, "It is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated than to shock the common feelings and ideas by forcible transportation and education of the infant against the will of the father." Instead of compulsory attendance, Jefferson proposed a different kind of incentive. Modeling his ideals off a new Spanish constitution that he admired, he recommended that the right to vote be withheld from those who cannot demonstrate basic literacy skills. He said, If we do not force instruction, let us at least strengthen the motives to receive it when offered. Jefferson himself, besides being a big proponent of common education, was a lifelong learner, interested in philosophy, science, math, and a myriad of other subjects. Jefferson was an amateur rather than a professional in many fields of science, including paleontology. He had the skull of a mammoth hanging in the entry room of Monticello, and his friends were constantly sending him fossils of animals they thought he would find interesting. In fact, Jefferson actually discovered a new species of giant American ground sloth via these gifted fossils. He described and named the animal, which is called Megalonyx jeffersoni, named after its discoverer. For over 20 years, Jefferson served as the president of the American Philosophical Society, the prominent scientific foundation at the time. His time as president of the Philosophical Society at one point even overlapped with his time as president of the United States. He was also an inventor, inventing the swivel chair, polygraph, and a revolving book stand, among other things. Overall, the man took his own education as seriously as the education of the nation, a true Renaissance man who kept on learning, building, and improving right until the end of his life. One of the most well-known of the Founding Fathers, Jefferson has been capturing our imaginations for centuries. He lived a life of the mind, helping to push our young nation to the heights of philosophy, science, and politics rarely before seen in the world. An accomplished writer, a proponent of complete religious freedom, and a lifelong learner, there is much to be learned from a life as full as his. Of course, I didn't mention nearly every aspect of the man's life, and there's much more to be gleaned from Thomas Jefferson, both his successes and his failures. The Roman poet Horace said in his epistles, "Interrogate the writings of the wise, asking them to tell you how you can get through your life in a peaceable, tranquil way." If we continue to seek out wisdom from those who lived before us, to interrogate the writings of the wise through books, as Jefferson himself did, we will undoubtedly find wisdom and knowledge that, if well applied, could help us to live our lives equal to some of the great men of history. That's what I aim to do in this series, find and interrogate the writings of the wise, and hopefully learn something along the way. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, and follow my blog, greatmen.wordpress.com. Now here's one last quote from Thomas Jefferson. "Determine never to be idle. No person will have occasion to complain of the want of time who never loses any. It is wonderful how much may be done if we are always doing."